Hello. Welcome, folks. It is great to see you all here, and welcome to Academics Bridging the Divide. I am really excited to hear from so many incredible educators and researchers about their work to address one of the most critical challenges of our times, the vitriolic political divisions in this country that I think that every single person in this room has experienced. My name is Randy Lioz, and I'm a master's student at the Carter School at George Mason University. And about 6 years ago, I had an experience that really changed my life. I was running depolarization workshops for a nonprofit. It was actually then called Better Angels, now Braver Angels. And I was at a skills training. And a woman there told me about how her relationship with her sister had been really strained because of politics. And at one point, she asked me a question about one of the skills that we had talked about. Now, I can't for the life of me remember what that question was or even what my answer sounded like. But I do remember the light going on in her eyes and this weight that seemed to lift from her shoulders at the thought that her relationship with her sister could be better. Those conversations could go better, that they could get some healing between them. And that was really a pretty big moment for me, since it shifted my whole career path. And it reinforced how much the healing of our country is about our personal relationships and how much we value the people around us, regardless of or even because of the difference in the perspectives that they bring. You know, in less than a month, we're going to have an election that is again being called one of the most important elections of our lifetime. And once again, many of us are going to need help restoring our bonds with family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, our fellow Americans. So to truly get back to the spirit of e pluribus unum, we're going to need a movement of bridge builders in every single community around the country. So I want to give a special welcome to the fellow students here. And I really encourage you to take advantage of the chance to talk to the scholars that we have here today. We have 11 amazing scholars that you're going to hear from, and I am just so excited and grateful that they have joined us. I think we all recognize how urgent this work is, and if you're considering charting an academic path, maybe even a career path that lets you help rebuild our civic bridges, I want to emphasize how meaningful that this work has been for me. And if you find your own role in this field, I think it could be deeply meaningful for you as well. So today we're going to hear from several people who have dedicated their careers to healing those rifts, both in this country and around the world. They include researchers who are pushing forward our knowledge of conflict dynamics with work in their labs. And just as crucially, they include practitioners who are leading work out in the field, where the rubber meets the road, right? Seeing what happens when those theories are applied to our very messy world. And some of them are doing both. You know, there are many aspects of this challenge that these folks are tackling, from the way our media and technology landscape is impacting how we see each other, and the stories that we have in our heads about the people on the other side, to the very urgent need to address the risk of political violence in our country, especially in the lead up to and the wake of this election. Now, I want to invite our initial panelists up on stage. Please come join us. So this discussion is going to focus on narratives. You know, we all know that we're a social species, that our social networks are the major advantage that has allowed humanity to become what it is. And it's really the stories that we tell that connect us with one another most powerfully. In fact, from the very beginning of our lives, we think in terms of story, with even pre-verbal toddlers seeing the world through the lens of narrative, with them as the protagonists. So the stories that we tell each other are so vital for the character of our relationships. I want to mention that one of our panelists is delayed There is a personal issue that he's dealing with, Dr. Daniel Brumberg. And so we're hoping that he will join us soon. He might perhaps be part of one of the later panels. He is the director of the Democracy and Governance Master's Program at Georgetown. And he also helped to create the In Your Shoes project, which one of our other panelists is also part of. So I'll be talking about that. That uses theater and performance to foster dialogue across the ideological divide. And it's part of the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics, or just the lab. And that's a cooperative effort between Georgetown School of Foreign Service and Department of Performing Arts. And I had the privilege of seeing that project in action when I worked with Dan through Braver Angels. So I'm very much looking forward to him joining us. And but I also want to introduce his colleague, and she is also from the lab's In Your Shoes project at Georgetown, Rabbi Rachel Gartner. And she is a professional dialogue trainer and facilitator who has been using performance for social transformation since she was an undergrad, and recognized that the arts are some of the best tools that we have for communicating what she calls the most subtle and significant elements of our lives, in a way that really highlights our common humanity across those differences. She's now Associate Director of the In Your Shoes project. So welcome, Rabbi Gartner.
Thank you.
And Rabbi Seth M. Limmer is the Director of Public Affairs at Peril, the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, which is part of the School of Public Affairs at American University. They have projects like the Extremism Research and Intervention Studio, where they use things like short-form video to impact the narratives that feed extremism. He has a doctorate in Hebrew literature from the Jewish Institute of Religion at Hebrew Union College in the field of rabbinic hermeneutics, which is the study of how we interpret the narratives in Scripture. And he also happens to be connected with Rabbi Rachel. They went to high school together. So welcome, Rabbi Limmer. And now, our final panelist is not a rabbi, and I don't believe that he went to high school with these folks either, but he does share with them a focus on narratives. Dr. Solon Simmons is a professor at George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, and the director of the Narrative Transformation Lab, aka TNT Lab. At that lab, he's developed tools focused on narrative to chart the path towards justice and peace, including root narrative theory, and he's just published his latest book, Narrating Peace: How to Tell a Conflict Story. Welcome, Professor Simmons. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Isaac Saul. Isaac is founder and editor-in-chief of Tangle, an independent media outlet that creates daily newsletters to elucidate the different perspectives on the issues that they cover for an audience of over 125,000 people across the political spectrum in over 55 countries. He grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, one of the most politically divided counties in the country, and has lived and traveled all over the world as a journalist. He helped create a solutions journalism media outlet with Ashton Kutcher, and has written for a ton of digital publications, and named by Yahoo News as one of the top voices shaping our elections. Please welcome Isaac Saul.
Awesome. I'm just going to make sure you guys can hear me okay. Everybody good back there? Awesome. Thank you, Randy, and thanks for putting this together. It's an incredible panel, and really glad to be here. I think I'd like to start maybe just 30,000-foot view of where we are, and give you each a minute or two to kind of describe the state of polarization in our country, in the United States, as it is today in your eyes. And maybe we can start with Professor Simmons and work our way back to me.
Sure. And can you hear me as well, or we need, no?
Oh, great.
Okay. So anyway, thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here, and it seems like a wonderful group of people to share ideas. So at the Carter School, we focus on conflict at many levels, anything from interpersonal conflict with spouses to what happens at work to what happens in international politics. So there's a certain scale and variance that we've always seen in those phenomena, and there are dynamics that play out in them. And what I see in the United States, I've been doing this work. I was trained as a sociologist. My PhD's in sociology. I've been studying politics. Yeah. Studied narrative in American politics as well since the 1990s. And it seems to me that there are certain phenomena that have been getting a lot worse lately that are anchored in what I'd like to call root narratives. We could talk about that if you're interested. But there are fundamental conceptions about what a moral life is and how one can live a moral life. And when you are put against someone else who has a very different conception of what a moral life is, and in that sense you're put in a black and white relationship with them, there's really only one thing to do, which is to win. And so what we've been trying to do at the Narrative Transformation Lab is to think about ways that inherently introduce dramatic tension, that is opposition, between, in a sense, a kind of us and a kind of them, but not in such a way that the other person is thought of as an adversary. And we talk about this in terms of journey stories versus struggle stories. And if you think about, I'm a narrative theorist, so every story needs conflict. You can't have a story without conflict, otherwise you simply move on. And one of the ways I characterize this is by saying peace is boring. But in the end, you need something, but you don't have to think about that other person as an adversary to be defeated, but instead perhaps as a force, a representative of a force, which is in fact a problem. So we try to approach polarization from that perspective, recognizing the other story, beginning the conversation as if you are curious about how they lived. And one of the ways that I talk about this is in terms of radical curiosity. That is in the roots to really understand what would it mean if this person actually made sense, and even though that's going to hurt you, to allow that to make sense. So I think that's one of the ways that I'd sort of start off to say that the country, and this is very interesting. One thing that I've noticed, been in this business a long time. There's a book from early 2000s by Morris Finorina, a political scientist. It talked about polarized America, and it suggested it was a myth. And we knew it was a myth because the American people were not polarized. It was the elites in Congress who were polarized. Now we're all polarized, which suggests something about what is driving this, which is elite behavior in the way in which they are engaging with one another and convincing others to not see their commonalities. So I think that's where I would leave that.
Rachel?
I just want to drop everything and read your book. So I'm distracted by that. Just for the record, I'm now the co-director of the In Your Shoes Research and Practice Center. I have to say, go girl. That's why I had to bring it up like that. And Seth and I haven't seen each other since high school, once since high school. So it's very funny that our connection was also about through theater. So I think I'm just kind of having a lot of moments here. I think that so I was the rabbi and director for Jewish life at Georgetown University since 2011 for about a little over a decade. And what I saw was a mix of inspiration and trouble all the time. And I was just thinking about an anecdote because I feel I can come at this from so many different places. Also as a mom, I can tell that story, or I can tell the story as a rabbi, or I can tell the story as a professor, as a teacher with students. But what comes to me right now is I recently had a group of students, and we were talking about empathy, and we were talking about what it would mean to walk into a room with people who had a radically different take on something that you feel really, really strongly about. And within minutes, a couple of hands went up, and the sentiment was, and a quote from a student said, "Why would I do that?" The amount of energy that I have had to spend over the time, and my colleagues, over the years of sort of cajoling and convincing and drawing out and asking and inviting people to reflect on why. Yeah, why would you want to do that? Was amazing to me. So a sort of inclination to kind of not go there was one piece that I saw over and over again. And then this sort of profound lack of skills that I often found myself cleaning up emotional messes from interactions that have seemed to have gone wrong, that were not because one person did it wrong and one person did it right, but because there was a lack of a ability to kind of work with your inner capacities to confront, to listen, to speak, to hear. There was a lack of skill in how to do that productively, and there was an incredible lack of trust, because I don't think that the adults around our students have helped them build that trust. We've thrown talking points at them rather than skills and capacities to build up. So I think that's sort of what over the years, kind of in a vague way, pushed me into this field. I want to talk about the perception gap. I want to talk about stories that from more like us, yes. And I will hope I'll return to that. But I think the work that we do at In Your Shoes is really about surfacing the stories that are true and that are difficult sometimes, but that help us discover who we are and what we care about most, that push against the misperceptions that we have of each other. They're also about creating a sense of we, a third thing that we can be a part of, that we can be productively engaging with across difference. Not about finding commonalities, but by finding common purpose, and rebuilding trust. So I can speak more to that later.
That's all great. At Peril, our polarization and extremism in our title, we focus in on a particular area of this world, which is the world of preventing violent extremism. And in the origin story of Peril, which is only about 4 years old right now, our co-founder, Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idris, who did all of her research on the resurgence of extremism in post-unification Germany, was sitting at American University in 2019 with other co-founder Dr. Brian Hughes, and realizing, oh, this extremism isn't just a problem in Germany, it's a problem here, and we should probably do something about it. So Peril exists to come up with creative ways, and I'll talk about our approach a little bit later on, because I know that's a question that's coming, to counter, prevent violent extremism that we've seen in this country, with the obvious and most notorious example, but far from the exclusive one, of January 6th. I would say, in terms of the question of what do we see as the presenting problem, there is a list of unstable democracies in the world. And the number one indicator of an unstable democracy is the level of tolerated political violence and tolerated political violent discussion. And the United States is third on that list of unstable democracies because of our polarized environment, because of the way that extremism has gone mainstream. And our focus at Peril is how do we come up with interventions that can reduce that polarization, that can rein in some of the extremism, that can stabilize our democracy.
Professor Simmons, I'm curious if maybe you could talk a little bit about the context of this moment we're in as it relates to our history as a country and maybe some other societies that you've written about or studied outside the U.S.
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting about the United States is that the divides that are most central to the politics of the political parties are not always the top thing that's being discussed. So I long ago wrote a book called The Eclipse of Equality. And what I meant by that was that there was, if you look at the post-World War II context, the main issues were what you might call socioeconomic issues, the things that divided the party of the New Deal from the Republican Party. And over time, that shifted. It shifted because of the civil rights movement in the Vietnam era, and the rise of concerns about social status versus what we might call social class. And these concerns played out in topics that we now call the culture wars, perhaps, where the various ways to address these concerns became front and sort of in the window that we're paying attention to, and in that period you had a reaction of the political parties, and they shifted. I don't think it became clear how they'd shifted until 2015 when Donald Trump came down the the escalator. I'm sorry, and you saw a different kind of rhetoric, a different voice, I would say, and that voice was, I think, at the maturation of politics that had gone back at least to the early 1990s, and figures like Patrick Buchanan and so on. Ross Perot is an interesting figure in this too. There were a change in the way that the narrative was playing out, and now, and this ties back to the question, the issue of elites and what we're doing. I even count us in this kind of a panel as part of this. Is how are we participating in that more complex context where it's not really a class struggle in the same kind of way. We called it a democratic class struggle in those days, but a much richer, more complex brew, and one in which the United States no longer can call all the shots. That's the other big issue. And, sort of interesting speculations about, for example, is our former President Trump in conversation with Vladimir Putin? And one doesn't know. He says no, but supposedly Bob Woodward says yes. And if that's true, then you have a kind of extra national politics going on, which is, could be seen as, in nationalist terms as, in a certain way, but I think it's just a reality of the global economy as well. And so we're confronted by a just much more difficult set of problems for that reason. And in some ways we need a global attitude to be able to address these issues in an effective way, but also to recognize that, in particular, going back to the perils focus and this extremism of what we now call the white working class, what is it that group of people, which is a very large group of people, requires to feel okay in the world, and not to give in to the worst aspects of that, but to think about things like, well, what would housing be like if you had a housing policy that still was liberal and respected the free market, but addressed housing concerns, education. We have kids in college. It's very hard for me to afford send my kids to college. I can only imagine for others, and health as well. So those big issues that require interdependencies, and how can you do that without falling into some kind of socialist utopia, recognizing the vibrancy of the United States and its free enterprise system and so on. So it seems to be the big challenge, and what I see really happening everywhere I look in the world.
Just to follow up, I think it's interesting that the way that in your work you've chosen to address some of these problems is through, what you call narrative tools. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about why that approach and what the results are that you see, because it does seem like there's a story you're identifying and then a story that you're trying to address.
Yeah. So that's always the big question: why narrative? Is this just a new, theory of the day or what have you? There's a long answer. I'll give you the short answer. The short answer is that in the study of politics, we know that rational choice is not the whole game. But you don't want to throw out the prefrontal cortex and go all the way to the amygdala. That is, emotions aren't the whole game either. I think I like to locate this if you know George Lakoff's work, if you know Jonathan Haidt's work. There's some interesting social psychology, cognitive work going on. But what they tend to do is they tend to almost entirely retreat into the emotional, metaphorical side, where I think what I call binary thinking. That is, you're either rational, you're either an angel, or you're a beast. You're just an animal. And obviously we exist in between, and that's why the theater and arts and everything matters so much. Is that we reflect on our minds can have access to our emotional life to some degree, and we can work with it. So if you think of this, Don't Think of an Elephant, George Lakoff, famous book, or Haidt, interesting, elephants matter. So the Haidt's work, which is to say the rider on the elephant drives you. You can't control the elephant. But if you think about a classic circus in the bad old days, they had elephants doing all sorts of things, And so it's an old Aristotelian virtue ethics, perhaps, about training the heart and doing the right thing and then becoming the right person. And that's where I see narrative work. Narrative work is in that space, the ternary space, not binary, but a third thing, which brings the mind and the heart together to go in the direction you'd like to go, which is, in a sense, the cultivation of virtue. So honestly, I think of the narrative work as that kind of Aristotelian project.
I want to stay here for a second, Rachel, and talk a little bit about how all of you guys have, identified ways to address this. You have this In Your Shoes program, which strikes me as a pretty novel approach, Can you talk a little bit about what happens in this program and how it applies to some of the issues Professor Simmons is discussing?
Yeah, sure. So what we do, we're sort of inheritors and builders of traditions of devised theater and of techniques from dialogue facilitation that have, that are all around us and prominent today in all of our circles. So devised theater is about the difference between devised theater and, say, another production is that we devise rather than having a writer come and tell the story, right, that we then embody, we devise the story from the people that are in the room, from the participants, right? So for In Your Shoes, we bring people, we either produce programs where we bring people together across difference, and that can be myriad types of difference. We had one of folks involved in U.S.-China relations. We've worked with the World Bank. We had Daniel, who is not here today, was instrumental in bringing students from Patrick Henry College in Virginia, an evangelical college, Christian college, together with students from Georgetown over 5 months, where we worked together to create an experience of we, right, that then we could share the story about in some sort of devised theater production. So we also do this for, I've worked on In Your Shoes for departments, for staff retreats, in interfaith contexts, where we ask folks to bring their full selves into a room, which can be very scary, through layers of questions and activities that slowly open them up to each other, and prompts that are designed to resonate sort of somewhere between the amygdala and the and the frontal cortex, right? Prompts that I like to see them as we throw a pebble in a pond and it ripples out and see with different layers of response come. So for an example, what is home to you? And we may end up in a conversation where someone says, 161 Claudia Lane, New Hyde Park, that's where I grew up, right? Or I don't have a home, or home is people, or that's a really difficult one for me, right? So we go, or what do you believe in? What are your fears? What are your hopes? What does care mean to you? What does it mean to be young? So we put the pebble in the pond and we allow folks to take it where they will go. And believe it, but believe you me, difference comes up. And actually things that are conflicting come up in those conversations. But in the process, we are creating a we experience. In my tradition, we tell stories. And we tell stories over and over and over again so that when we choose the stories that we tell over and over again and when we tell them, so that we can identify with those stories, they will seep into us and they will shift our consciousness so that we can then be shaped by those stories and how we show up in the world. We try to create stories that didn't exist, stories of we that did not exist before we gathered our group, and hope that that shapes the way our participants show up in the world. We also distill skills, concrete skills, as part of that process. And then sometimes we share that out to a communal audience. I'll just add one other piece, which is, this is not unique in the universe, but I would say our special sauce is a process where we pair our participants up across differences. And we invite them to have a conversation. They record the conversation just for themselves. And then they excerpt words of each other's part of the conversation, and they make that their script. So it's a verbatim practice. And if you think about, I know as a rabbi, we do things like we reflect back. I hear you saying, right? That's me hearing you. In dialogue facilitation, I learned to get closer. So for you, it feels like this. And in this work, we work on embodying a moment in a person's life and all of the nuances that brings up. to hopefully engender an experience of, wow, oh.
I'm curious, when you bring students like from the evangelical school to Georgetown, where the kind of moments of tension tend to arise, or where the friction comes up, and if you see sort of recurring themes at these kind of tension points?
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of amazing that when you start with the personal, we haven't had a lot of flare-ups. People are always asking, what happened? We just haven't had them. I would say that the things that have sparked a little bit are faith, right? Sort of, are you a person of faith, or are you a atheist, or are you an anti-faith person? And how could I possibly embody the words of someone from a different side of that, because some of it is so deep and personal, it cuts so hard against where I am with that. Sexuality has been another one. I think the idea that people can't believe that the other side is as hurting as they are. People can't believe that the fear is as real as it is. People don't trust that what you're saying isn't strategic. That comes up.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I definitely sense when I talk to people about politics that there's always especially political divides and personal issues, there's always antennas being up is quite obvious in those conversations, and it feels like there's sort of landmines everywhere. Seth, I want to move some of your work at Peril. You guys talk about a pre-preventative approach for addressing mis and disinformation. Obviously, an issue that I think is really important, especially in my world, in the media ecosystem. I mean, I spent last week trying to convince people that FEMA wasn't stopping aid relief from going into North Carolina. I'd love to hear a little bit about that approach, how it's different, and why you think it's working.
Sure. At Peril, we follow the public health model. The easiest, or I don't know about the easiest, but the usually most general way to explain this is we can all think back to anti-smoking campaigns, right? Which was everything from PSAs on TV to labeling products, sometimes with like very graphic imagery about the negative content in a pack of cigarettes or any sort of tobacco product. And over a span of 40 years, cigarette smoking and the side effects of cigarette smoking have gone down in America because we took a preventative approach to try and convince people that one of America's favorite pastimes should no longer be America's favorite pastime. And, to go in my lifetime from, being in Manhattan to every bar being filled with cigarette smoke to being in Manhattan where every bar has one person outside smoking a cigarette in 20-degree weather is a huge change in the lung health of Americans, right? And that's a long, sustained public health campaign that never took a cigarette out of anybody's hand, but just tried to change public awareness around the issue. That's exactly what we think the approach needs to be on polarization and extremism. So, for example, when I was up doing a round of Capitol Hill in the spring, many congressional offices would say, "What do you got for me for this election?" I said, "Nothing." So what we're working on is really to help make for a better election culture in 2032 and maybe in 2028, because that's the kind of change we think is really going to be necessary. So when you apply that to the digital space, I think we should start with a few truths that we all know. Two major categorizations of what makes the digital space so dangerous is that it is an echo chamber. And all the algorithms are set up so that when you like something, you get more of that thing. And if what you like is any kind of borderline extremist content, you are going to get more of that extremist content. And because extremist content sort of feeds its own narratives, you're likely to indulge in that more and more and more and more and more. Right? So that's one aspect of the online world that is particularly dangerous. Another is that people want attention. Right? I've got two college-age kids. When we were growing up, we did not know what an influencer was. Right now,
last week.
my older one's like best friend from college, best friend from home, makes $150,000 a year and gets free trips all over the world as an influencer because she poses online and then gets people to buy her stuff. Like I don't quite get it, but this is a way of life. And young people in particular realize that the louder they talk, the more people pay attention. We sort of call that a soapbox community. So if you find a soapbox and what you say on that soapbox gets heard, you want to say it louder and louder and louder to keep the likes coming in, to keep the attention, and maybe to become an influencer yourself, which is a hallmark of modern success. So if we take those two things that we know to be true, the question is, how do you counter that from a public health perspective? And this is where like health is right on. And I'll use an example from 2020. There's no doubt that as COVID happened, there was just tons of mis and disinformation around vaccines that flooded social media. Peril got involved in a public health campaign where we created what we called at the time digital inoculation videos. And if you think about an actual flu shot, you get a little bit of the flu so that your body adjusts to it and you don't get a worse case of the flu. That's why most people feel terrible the day after they get their flu shot, because you actually get the flu a little bit. So these digital inoculation videos are built on the same principle, that you get a little bit of the mis and disinformation, but then you get explained to you not just why it is bad information, but the technique that the person who's sharing that mis and disinformation is using to manipulate you. And the principle and the findings that we have on the research we do around these videos is that nobody likes being manipulated. And once you know that someone's trying to manipulate you to believe something, you are less likely to believe that particular message and all other messages that are like that. So in the digital realm in particular, that's what we now call it pre-bunking, because people don't like getting a shot. This pre-bunking stuff is seeing emerging memes that are hateful, that lead to extremist behavior, coming up with explanatory debunking videos. You might have seen this terrible meme that casts Hamas as a revolutionary liberation movement, but when you hear things like rape is revolution, it should give you pause to think, what are these people actually trying to get you to believe, right? So that is the key to our digital inoculation work, which we can do across a variety of different forms of emerging hate, whether it's anti-LGBTQ stuff, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, political extremism, supremacist theory, all those different kinds of things. So that's the particular technique we use online.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I could say anecdotally in my work, I've noticed that if I'm trying to convince somebody that the election wasn't stolen in 2020, it's a lot more effective for me to talk about the person supplying them that information and the money they're making off, like someone like Dinesh D'Souza selling a movie for $20 and making millions of dollars, talking about the kind of grift than it is explaining how ballots are counted or how we know that the state measures are preventing this certain kind of fraud from happening. People are a lot more receptive to the idea of, oh, you're actually being fooled here. So that resonates for me. I guess I'm curious, outside your organization, if you've seen these tactics being employed by media organizations. I mean, again, I know from my work that it's extremely hard to, debunking something or fact-checking something is almost a meme itself now in a lot of circles politically, and it's like a signifier that you're full of BS, basically. So I'm curious if you've seen, places, organizations that are combating this stuff well, or tactics that seem to be working maybe outside of Peril.
There are two tactics that work. They're both kind of connected to Peril, so I'm only partially answering your question. I apologize for that. One is a partnership that we actually have with the Department of Homeland Security, developing a K-5 curriculum on, we call it DUCK, totally nonpartisan. It's just how young people cannot fall victim to online scams and misinformation. So it covers everything from potential credit card scams to giving away your social security number to how people try to manipulate you online, which is a tool as these K-5 people, hopefully before they get their phones and get their Instagram and Facebook or whatever account, Threads, or I don't think they're using Threads, accounts that they get, TikTok, right? They're already have it in their mind that there are some bad actors out there, and they already know what some of the techniques bad actors use. They already know about algorithms. They have a savvy about how the system is set up to lead them astray and have some skills to resist. So that's a partnership with the public school system. That curriculum has been in place in 3 public schools and is now being developed to roll out across the country. Another place where we've seen partnership, but it's been limited, and you can quote me on this, but the companies would deny it. During COVID, there were some of these big companies, because they know the algorithms and they know who's watching what, where if they saw that somebody watched 3 COVID mis or disinformation videos, they'd put a pre-bunking video in front of them. They'd put it in their feed, right? These companies don't want to be mandated or regulated to have to do that, but there have been cases where some of them have voluntarily worked to add in some of this inoculation work or pre-bunking work into some of into the feeds of some of the people who follow the most, we call it MDM, misdis, malinformation. So people who watch a lot of MDM content can be fed these things. That's not anything that any of these companies has committed to as a long-term proposition. It's not something that any of them will say that they've done publicly, probably for good reason. But it is a technique that's out there that has been used that we and others are trying to figure out how to maximize and make a little bit more standard.
So we've talked a little bit about the problems, how each of your organizations separately are addressing these and approaching these. Seth, you just mentioned, not planning for this election, but planning for the next one. I'm curious, and this is a question for the group, whoever feels inspired to answer, how you guys view the trajectory we're on. I think there's a world in which this problem of polarization and the things that are downstream from that, like misinformation, conspiracy theories, whatever else, gets better, and that maybe we've hit rock bottom. Candidly, I actually believe that. I'm sort of a zag on this, I think, in this space. But I think there's also a very realistic world where it continues to get worse, and maybe we haven't really seen the bottom yet, which is a scary thought. I'd be interested to hear from you guys about how you view where we're going, because it does seem like there are a lot of people who want to address this problem, yet at the same time, the digital infrastructure, all these things that sort of contribute to it are scaling upward, which is a little bit scary too.
I'll take a shot. I don't think we've hit bottom. I'm going to start there. But I don't think we're too far from bottom in the sense that, but here's the way I'm seeing it. I mentioned already, it's about, this whole phenomenon we used to describe as globalization, what's happening in this space. The United States, the post-war order is changing. I'm not saying it's collapsing. I'm just saying it's changing. That post-World War II is what I'm talking about. And so we are going to have to recreate this in some way. I'm a peace professor. I'm a professor of peace. There used to be a very powerful peace movement, which is at the very center of politics. This is the 1890s I'm talking about. And it gave birth to things like the Nobel Peace Prize, and it gave birth to the development organizations and a variety of other kinds of organizations. I don't think that global elites, and I'm going to come back to that level, those people we know, interact with, so on, some of us we don't have access to, I don't think they've fully recognized that the next world that's coming and plan for it. So I think until you get there, until you've got a global community somehow all recognizing that we need to solve and climate change may be we're thinking about Florida right now, right? What's happening right now. I think that may help drive that, that we're just going to see disasters on a scale that will force us to recognize we're in the same boat. We need to start rowing together. So I'm very optimistic in a certain way, but I'm pessimistic in the short term because I think that we still don't fully understand. My Twitter feed feels like TikTok now, and I don't like it, but I don't know how to get back to something where I can get good information. Maybe I go to Tangle, that's where I go, right? So anyway, that's my basic take, is that I think that we've still got more to go, and we have to recognize we're in the same boat together. Eventually, you're going to have enough people who do, but as long as there are oligarchs who can say, no, I still benefit from this, they're going to still try to manipulate the nation states, and that's going to be trouble.
I'm thinking about three things. I'm thinking about interventions, I'm thinking about peace economy, and I'm thinking about owning your why. So that's three things. I say them because I'm afraid I'll forget them. So thank you. Another piece that I think we forget, and the students remind me of this, people remind me of this every day, that when we're on a computer, we don't see the person who we're throwing stuff at. Right, when we're recording, when we get together in a group and we ask people to look at each other and to repeat back their names, and it would be, you'd be amazed. I'm always amazed. I'm amazed over and over again, such a simple thing. The emotion that comes up and the rethinking, the self-awareness that comes up. What am I bringing to this space and how is it landing in somebody else? How am I receiving what is coming at me? As a rabbi, I used to, when I would have one-on-one conversations, there would be people coming into my office with problems, and sometimes I didn't like the people. I'm not a saint. We don't have to be. But within 5 minutes of them talking to me, I loved them, and I grew as a human, right? And I think there's something that we forget about the interpersonal, and the pandemic didn't make it any easier. And I know this is sort of in the pie in the sky. We can't bring people together. There's not a peace economy that is investing in this kind of work, but there are practitioners, and I do think we need to invest in these interventions. I remember learning that in Ireland, there were $100 a day spent per person on peace-building efforts. And in Israel, Palestine, less than 5. I also have been aware of stories and people that peace build and work together and tell other stories and find their way to each other across difference that nobody knows about. We've been doing it for 20, 30 years and nobody knows because the investment is not in those places. Now there's a big look towards all of us, and that's really exciting, and there's a part of me that's like, where have you been? But let's keep it going. So interventions, a peace economy. And then last, just coming to the why, I think one of the things that I try to suggest to people when they come together across difference, I have strong political feelings too, and I can understand why people are reluctant to come together. And I often sort of say, you need to find your own why, right? It may be because the person in front of you has become a monster and you need to humanize them again to expand your soul. It may be because you need to become a better advocate. You need to know your enemy's heart, right? I mean, you're not going to bring that up in the room, but so you can be more productive in your advocacy work. Or it may be because you're very concerned about our democracy and diversity is a fact. This is Diana Eck, I think. Diversity is a fact. Pluralism is an achievement. I would say it's a practice. It's an investment. So I don't know where we're headed, but I think I have ideas of where I'd like us to push.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the investment element of this too. I mean, I won't quote the number because I don't remember it off the top of my head, but I remember reading about the amount of money that a lot of groups in Israel spend on peace building efforts and how much of it goes towards English and Hebrew language and how much of it goes towards Arabic. And the English and Hebrew language it was like 10, 20, 30-fold more, which strikes me as a huge problem in the effort. And I think it is, I think the investment part of it is something that we could definitely see change and maybe tilt the equation a little bit.
Maybe that's where I was going to weigh in, but I'm going to come to that second. The troubling signs are there's like a rise in far-right extremism and authoritarianism. Hungary, Germany, France, America. As a Jew, I never want to say we don't have to worry about an authoritarian rising to power And we'll avoid this in our safe democracy. So I don't want to be able to speculate how serious any of those threats are, including the one in the United States. I think there are real and serious threats that are dangerous and scary. That's the negative sign. The positive sign is that starting in 2015, a new space emerged in America called the democracy space, when people realized that we actually need to do work, whether that's like practical, hands-on, organizational, community work, or funding, to make sure that our democracy remained a democracy and didn't transform into some other form of government or wasn't robbed of all of its democratic power. And for the last 7 or 8 years, that democracy space has almost exclusively been focused on elections and get out the votes, and how do we handle the crisis that we see threatening democracy right now. In the last year, and this is, Rachel, exactly to your point, that democracy space, whether it's on-the-ground practitioners or it's like the highest level of funders, have gotten tired of spending millions of dollars or millions of hours of energy turning out votes or making sure people vote in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio. And like, how do we get to the root of the problem that is tearing our democracy apart? And those people are realizing that you need to work on making sure everyone has safe and fair access to this election. And you need to make sure that the context and the vitriol around the next election can improve. And that we need to do both at the same time. So for me, it's an encouraging sign that the broader swath of people who are interested in protecting our democracy are now seeing this preventative work as essential.
I have one last question for you guys, and we're coming up on time here, so I want to open it up for Q&A too. So if you have some questions or thoughts, you can get those organized a little bit. Before I do, though, something occurs to me that I've observed, I think, in kind of the depolarization space, which is that I feel like there is a lack of conservative right-wing representation in the space in a way that strikes me as problematic. And, I'll say my personal politics are pretty centrist. I don't know any of your personal politics, so I don't want to, broad brush anybody. But, I've seen, especially in the last few months, indicators that make it very clear to me that a lot of the kind of polarization issues and conspiratorial issues exist on the left too. I mean, with the Trump assassination attempt, I heard very liberal progressive friends say very seriously, like, I wish he didn't miss. And that language was out there, that attitude was out there. And then I saw, the conspiracy spread on platforms like X about how the whole thing was staged and he didn't actually get shot and all this stuff, which of course was just total bunk. And, this is something I think that is a problem not just here but abroad. I know Professor Simmons, Seth, you guys have experience talking and thinking about this in the more international perspective too. And I guess my question is, what's the significance of the fact, if my judgment there is right, which I think it is, that there is a little bit of that lack of representation in the depolarization space, what's the significance of that, and how can we bring that side into it as well? Because it does feel like, it feels to me like it's not as represented as it could or should be, and that there are a lot of problems on the left that we have to deal with as well.
If I could jump in. So George Mason University, what's interesting about it, and not everyone may know this, but it historically had a very strong, and because of the way that the government is structured and the Board of Visitors that governs the university is structured, has a very strong right-wing component in our governance. So we've had to engage with what you might call, I'm just going to call them Republicans because that's what they are. But they're framed, for example, we have the author, the editor of the Project 2025 education section on our board. So that means we've got a very different point of view. So what it's forced us to do, and I'm president of the Faculty Senate, so I'm on that board, so it's forced us to engage others, radically different, and figure out what they're like and what do they actually want. And it turns out these Republican leaders love democracy too, and they're interested in human rights. And they believe that one of the greatest threats to human rights is too much government power. And so if you can engage them where they are, and you can say, well, we're worried about things like that too, then you can generate a space for concern for democracy and human rights and how to preserve that within the university. So I'm actually very optimistic about what we can do in this space, because in some ways there's a certain kind of, if you're thinking about where this education agenda is hitting hardest, it might be George Mason University in the country. And so we have this opportunity to engage it in a different kind of way, which means we can engage the entire conversation in a different sort of way. So that's just a little anecdote, an interesting one, but it makes me optimistic, frankly.
I'm curious. I know we have another Rachel from Georgetown here who will be speaking later on a panel. I'm wondering if you have what to contribute to this, because I think this is a question that I've also come across, that sometimes when we put it out there, who shows up, and then they're looking to who's leading and how do we kind of representation in the leadership. So I think this is something we're puzzling through. I will say, in a similar anecdotal, optimistic kind of mode, that this group from Patrick Henry and Georgetown, which was remarkably diverse in so many different ways, on January 6th, that day, we got phone calls from students who had family members involved in the goings-on of January 6th, and we had students who couldn't be more different from those students, let's say. They all called us and said, we need to get back together. We want to, and we don't want to talk to anybody else. We need to talk to you. We have a video about it. You're welcome to see it. But so I do think some of, how we put it out there, figuring out how to be more invitational. I don't have an answer, but I do have moments also of real optimism.
I'll share two different data sets. We spend some time up on Capitol Hill in different congressional offices, and those include Republican offices too. I will say that most of those Republican offices said, let's wait and see after this election before we go forward. But a group like the Problem Solvers has great interest in the work that we're doing at Peril and learning more about it and trying to take it on as a bipartisan issue. So I think that there is a sort of exhaustion of oxygen that happens in this country, or especially right over there, in the months before an election. But I think that after the election, there are people who want to work on this, specifically what we either call moderate or old-line Republicans, who are not happy with the MAGA part of their party, see it as extremist, and want some help in reclaiming their party by tamping down extremism more broadly. So I do think that there's some room for doing that there. I would also say that in some of our state-based, like on-the-ground community work, we have had some interest in traditional red states. It's usually come to us out of incidents, a terrible incident around anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or political violence that's led people to reach out to us. But those people who reach out, which usually includes a pretty purple mix, they get that extremism and hate are really at the core of the problem and are open to taking a holistic approach to it. So I think over there, like on the Hill, there is a little bit more of a politically aspect to this, but on the ground, I think people who are confronting what extremism and polarization bring to their hometowns and the kind of violence and divides that it brings, when they want help, then the color doesn't matter as much if it's red or blue.
All right, I think with that, we started about 5 or 10 minutes late, so maybe we'll add another 5 or 10 minutes to the clock for some audience Q&A. Randy, I don't know if you have a preference about the best way to do that, if there's another mic you want to pass around, or just a show of hands. And
yeah, and there's another mic up there, so we can pass these around. So if you want to raise your hand if you have a question. I see one over there, I see one over here. So, and I think I saw one over there. So get to folks in order. Here you go.
The optimist in me wants to believe that the news media, and particularly also social media, are both exaggerating and exacerbating our sense of how polarized this country really is. And sometimes when I'm on X, or I happen to watch Fox News, I actually believe that people are engaging in a form of cosplay. Almost, they are protected, particularly on social media, to just gas off about whatever they want to say. And I'm wondering to what degree you, members of the panel, believe that is really contributing to our sense that the problem is hopefully not as bad as we might think it is.
I just wanted to go back to the work of around the perception gap. To my understanding, you'll correct me because you're nodding a lot, that I think, as I understand it, blue and red have almost twice, they believe that the other side is almost twice as extreme as they are, percentage-wise, right? That the percentage of the folks that are extreme, which is real and true, is about half of the percent that we assume it about the other, and that watching the news makes it worse. Is that right? This is what it said. This is what I've heard. I would love some corroboration from the group, but this is what I've been reading. That the more you actually pay attention to various media, the wider the gap is in your perception to the reality, which is why I'm so invested in telling other stories.
Just really quick, I actually want to say something about this. I know I'm not technically on the panel, but I work in the media space, and an interesting experience that I have all the time is that I actually meet members of Congress or political pundits or journalists or influencers who I have witnessed how they act and present themselves online, and then I meet them in person, and 90% of the time, they are unrecognizable. I mean, literally unrecognizable. And it's something I've written about. It is jarring. Like people like Charlie Kirk, or, people on the left like Hassan, I forget his last name, the Twitch streamer who's just like total flamethrower. And they're nice and thoughtful and inquisitive. And they're like, ask questions, and they're interested, and they seem open-minded or present themselves as open-minded. I forget which one of you mentioned it, but like there is a reward structure on these platforms for being as bombastic and over the top as possible. And there's something like very fundamental that happens in our brain. And it happens to me. I have a Twitter account. When I tweet something and I see 2,000 likes come in on it, it feels kind of good. And it's nice to feel like people are reading your work or caring about your thoughts or your hot take or whatever it is. And if you see that correlate with being more and more over the top, you're going to do more of it. I think it's one of the reasons that I'm a little bit optimistic and Pollyannish about things, is because I agree that a lot of these people are doing some form of cosplay that I think is very apparent when you see how they sort of operate and exist in space in the real world, not online.
Good morning. I had been involved in the depolarization bridging space for quite a number of years, and there's a gap that I've noticed that I wanted to hear your thoughts on and who was maybe tracking to it. And that is particularly the emphasis on affective metrics, affective effects, all these sorts of things. And I sort of looked at it and said, like, what about the cognitive side? Like, people are angry for reasons. They would explain themselves in X, Y, Z explanations. And we know from law of non-contradiction, not every narrative can be right. And so, like, there is a legitimate, like, no, your argument's better than their aspect. And I haven't seen that picked up by anybody left, right, or center and saying, like, this is what we need to do in terms of deconflicting public ideas, in terms of working to the bottom, argumentation, reasoning, debate, blah, blah, blah. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on, A, that, if you will, confirmation bias, or that bias to the depolarization world. And secondly, who you thought was sort of leading that change in perspective.
I'll take a shot at that one just because it seems so much at the heart of why we study narrative. So I wanted to bring up the concept of alternative facts. Remember Kellyanne Conway? And when I heard her say that, I think it was on Meet the Press, I can't remember what she said. Anyway, she said that, and I thought, there's actually something interesting in that. And the point being this, that information is not enough, and therefore argument is not enough, meaning that we can do social science, we can say this causes that, but the social science doesn't allow us to know if it's good or bad that happened. And therefore, the relationship between explanation and evaluation is more complex. So I think that there are ways to debunk obvious falsehoods, but the same event, the killing of one human being by another, if you begin the story earlier, might seem different. that it did happen. You can say this person did this and that's why that person is dead. And then you might say, well, thank goodness because of all these reasons, if you believe in that sort of violence. Or if it isn't killing, it's something less than that. But it's actually an aggressive or at least a very deeply assertive action. So we take the position at the lab, there's no way outside of narrative, which doesn't mean that you have to give way to, that's what I said earlier. You don't have to just accept the beast and that's what we are, but that you have to train the elephant, that you have to learn to recognize when this is an inhuman thing and we should. So for example, my president, George Mason, after October 7th, the original October 7th, put out a pretty strong statement because it just seemed like the obvious thing to do. But he caught a lot of flack for that because he wasn't balanced supposedly in the way he did it. But the human experience of saying that what I'm witnessing, if it's really happening, is not okay. So it's the same fact, but then the interpretation is entirely different. And so that's just my standard reaction to the cognitive. It's a cognitive emotional brew, is what I often like to say.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more.
Hi, my name is Piper Hendricks, and I run an organization called Stories Change Power. So not surprisingly, I have a question about stories. And when we're talking about the bigger narrative, I'm curious how each of you would describe what is the narrative that we, the bigger collective we, are living, are understanding right now, and what would you like to see? How would you like to change that?
Thanks, Piper. I think the narrative that affects this panel, this topic, is that the other side is the enemy and that they need to be vanquished. I think that is the number one most detrimental narrative story that's out there. It is on whatever side of whatever conflict I think you're looking at. That's what's led, I believe, and some studies have shown too, that have led me to believe that, to the rise in political violence, is that this is a life or death issue. This, therefore, can only be addressed in a certain way. Therefore, violence is allowed. Therefore, hatred is allowed. Therefore, othering is allowed. Therefore, dehumanization is allowed. And all of those things are the antithesis of what I care about as a human being, what all of us care about. So to me, that's the number one story that's out there, is that there is this other who is dangerous and who needs to be taken down at all costs because of their threat. And that's what I'd identify as the most problematic story that's out there.
I think hand in hand with that and underlying that is scarcity, that there just isn't, that there isn't enough, that we're living in a narrative that there isn't enough, and the other one is my enemy and getting what's enough in every kind of way. And I would love to replace that with abundance, and not a naive, this sounds naive, I understand how that can sound naive, but there are enough, I believe there is enough of everything. We just have to allow ourselves to see it that way and distribute it fairly and work on it fairly. So yes, and I to the other piece about narratives, and I do think that there are toxic ideas, and that people adhere to toxic ideas as a result of the narratives that they are living through, or the experiences, or the way they're mediating their experience, or the actual experiences that they are really having that are toxic experiences. And I believe that the reason I'm invested in this type of work is it feels like one tool among many to get to the people underneath the ideas and the experiences and why we are wedded to certain narratives, to really understand, and that they'll become, a commitment will emerge to clarity.
So
Maybe
I think we're
one
gonna
more, I think.
take one more question, yes.
Excuse me. Can I ask a question, please?
Sorry, we had one more question and over here, and I apologize, we don't have time for an additional one. Please go ahead.
Sorry. I want to ask, my opinion is that depolarization is imperative, I think, especially in the past year, of which we've seen, particularly anyone that's been on any sort of college campus of which I, live near, work, and also write about. But how do you square that with kind of the desire that I think people have to actually win political battles and fights? Because I kind of feel that like it's nice to have these discussions, but it's also just the fact that people have very strong convictions and people like want to win. So the incentive is to use the most extreme, loudest, language that you can in order to basically, to win, essentially, to win the moral argument, to win the emotional argument, and to tap into those very visceral feelings. And, we mentioned Israel and stuff, but like that's been a huge topic in terms of how people talk about Israel over the past year. So like, how do you like square those two things? Like, is it really possible to have that in this current environment that we have?
I'd like to jump in that. So one ways in which I'm not the typical peace person is that I believe deeply in constructive conflict and good trouble. Yeah. And I think we've been kind of hinting at that here already. And so the question is, is to become better yourself. I think this is more of a question for our what do we do now in a given situation, is to be able to judge in this particular situation, am I in a prisoner's dilemma where there's a win-win if I could just cooperate with this person and work out? Or am I, is this something where I really have to overcome? I think, Rachel, you said this already, that this is a person that I have to push back on in a certain kind of way, and I have to win the election, and then I'll deal with it. So I think that the challenge is to become better at diagnosing conflict situations in that sense, but to not always be the person who has to win. And I think very much on the left, I've seen this, because those are my circles, it's about always fighting for justice, always fighting for justice. And that's beautiful and makes sense and might lead to peace eventually. But the question is, what would you do if you had an opportunity? What if you got a seat at the table? Would you be able to capitalize on it? Would you have the skills? Would you have the curiosity and interest? And I think that's where I worry. There's a point where you have to pivot. And so what we're trying to do is talk about what makes those kinds of stories different. What is the difference between a justice story and a peace story, and how are they related and complementary?
Yeah, I'll just add into that. As in my couple of decades as a congregational rabbi, my training was also as a community organizer, and so to take this out of the national spotlight and put it in Chicago, where I live, where everyone's a Democrat, right? So like there's no red, blue, which is what quality of blue are you? Being a part of community organization work, old school in Chicago, is about finding success with government, right? And people who, if I'm doing work on gun violence now, we're working with the mayor on something who just shut down a great technology that most people in communities want, but we're still working with that governor who made a terrible decision in our mind to help him make a different decision and enact a different set of policies, right? And I think on the ground in many places, that kind of local organizing, dedication to working across lines of difference, whether they're based on political party or not, they're still highly effective. Whether or not or how much they're working on Capitol Hill is a different story, but I think that provides us the model for going forward for exactly as Solon said, how to be effective in getting the political change that you want, as opposed to just talking about the political change you'd like to see.
All right, Professor Simmons, rabbis, thank you guys. Appreciate it. Round of applause for our panelists.
All right. Thank you so much to all our panelists and to Isaac.